Hello, and welcome to Business as Unusual, where I talk to folks that are working to create a world that works for all of us. And I'm very excited to have Julie Kratz here of the Next Pivot Point. Did I say your name correctly?
You did.
Awesome. I should have checked that before. However, and I'd love to have you maybe let people know a little bit about like what you're up to, and then I have some fun questions, I hope, and we'll go from there.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I can't wait. Yeah, so I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work as a outside practitioner, speaker, consultant, author, and have had the chance to do this work for going on 8 years now. So super thankful. The conversation around inclusion is swiftly changing and morphing and growing, which is exciting. Was
Mhm.
not necessarily the case in my corporate days, and certainly when I started all of this. So thankful to have this conversation.
Yeah, no, so I've been following Julie's publications, emails, I don't know, for a while. And something I really appreciate is there's a combination of invitation and practicality that speaks to my inner efficiency model. It's like, okay,
It
here
shouldn't have
are
to be,
things
like,
to do.
so hard, right? Like, not everyone can
Mhm,
read 10 books about inclusion. Like, that's just I wish more people
right.
did, but gotta make it simple for folks to join.
Well, and we are by nature problem focused, and so a lot of times we'll spend, I think, more time than is maybe necessary in really like getting that problem like dialed, like fleshed out and pick and then there's like, but what about also putting maybe some of that energy into engagements, disruptions, changes, possible fixes, which I think is another trap we can fall into because it's like, will this guarantee to be working? Well, no, but the stuff we're doing is also not working. So it's really like, but I just really appreciate that approach a lot because I think it helps to disrupt that as well, that sort of fixation on the academic
Mhm.
mental process, I guess. You
Yeah.
mentioned being an author, and you follow up with that, but also you wrote a children's book, which I think is fantastic. What inspired that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was I think a lot of things, like, having done the work for so much with adults that we know
Mhm.
as the research, like, bears out, like, they're not our brains not that we can't change behavior, but it's a lot easier to understand something like diverse and experiences earlier in life versus later in life, and our biases are pretty well baked by age 12. And again, not that we can't shape and change our behavior later in life, it's just a whole lot easier to go to the root cause
Mhm.
of it. So after
Yeah.
spending a lot of time with corporate types talking about unconscious bias and how to be inclusive, is like, oh, what if we had this conversation earlier? Then maybe we wouldn't have to have it so much later in life. But it's a controversial issue. I mean, depending on where folks are from in the country,
Mhm.
you see these school board meetings gone awry when they mention something about critical race theory or social emotional learning or diversity and
Mhm.
inclusion. And simply, we're just trying to teach kids how to be global citizens. I mean, they're going to live this next generation, and I mean, we're all living in a very intensely global world. They're going to interact with folks from different cultures, from different races, from different gender identities, different sexual orientations, different beliefs. Like they're going to interact with them at a much higher rate than past generations. So we're doing them a disservice if we don't talk about how to be inclusive and understanding of differences, which, by the way, most kids, when you ask them, they get a lot more than adults get. Like,
Mhm.
and my 8-year-old was asking so many interesting questions summer of 2020, as we're watching what's bearing out in the news cycle and just the tragedy of all of it. And that was like my aha is like, she's like, explain to me what racism is, mom. Like, you do your best to kind of go through it as a white
Yeah.
person of like people being treated unfairly based on their skin color. And then she's like, well, why would people do that? And then why would that happen? It's like this 5 whys. And you finally get to a place where she's just like, mom, this makes no sense to me. I'm like, yep,
Right?
it doesn't.
No. No, they
So that
really
was
yeah. I
yeah.
think it's great because there's so many studies that have shown that one of the biggest indicators of kids being able to grow up to be just more comfortable across difference is having a lot of difference in their youth and being,
Mhm.
interacting with people of different backgrounds. And I think maybe, there's a lot of psychology around it, and I'm not a psychologist, so I'll just touch on that and say that in a very simplistic way, it makes sense. It's less threatening if it's familiar, right? If you live in a world where you deal with differences and you engage across cultural changes, you're less likely to have an instinctive fear of that. I mean,
Yeah.
and that fear is what often, and it's what's interesting to me. I worked for a long time in LGBTQ activism. Is there's a certain amount of good intentions or fear, and almost fear of offense, but like genuinely, like both not wanting to look bad, but also not wanting to cause discomfort, that leads to some of the worst problems I've seen. And it's just kind of it's in, at least in that world. And I'm curious if that's something you're nodding that you run into with folks where you're like, wow, they have the heart and somehow they're making it worse. That just feels so tragic.
And all too common. Yeah. I mean, it's intentions versus impact. So, intention is I'm showing up with good intentions. I want to be a better ally. I want to make the person feel included. I'm shocked by what's happening. So, I really want to like do something to change this. And the flip side to that is people are like, why are you just now joining the conversation? Why are you trying to make it about you now? Like, why are
Mhm.
you trying to save the day for me? Because that's not what I want, right? I want to be
Mhm.
listened to. I want to be affirmed. I want to be believed. I want you to take action. Those are all things that people really want. But people come into this conversation just alarmed, and they
Mhm.
don't even realize what they're doing with that bewilderment is instead of staying curious, they're getting
Mhm.
judgmental, they're getting angry. And for somebody that's experienced a lot of adversity in their life, like, come on, like you just spent 15 minutes like learning about
Yeah.
this. And I've been spending my whole life dealing like with this. So slow your roll, like don't take over. Listen to me first, and let's talk about what support looks like together.
Mhm. Do you find companies are receptive? I feel like, having done this work from a like that different perspective, that there might be like, I would run into folks who were clear, usually because there was a problem, right? Like they wanted to deal basically with a lawsuit prevention. But there wasn't like that, like what you're talking about, like that overall commitment in a way that, um, and in a way that the leadership really seemed to, and obviously there's always caveats, but like really seemed to understand that this wasn't like an HR issue or a one person. Like this had not just a way of benefiting maybe the employee or the group that was being treated badly, but actually ultimately would benefit the entire company. But that like drawing that line, I feel like I haven't yet seen it seem really clear. And I'm not sure what, like you were saying, like for the kids, it's obvious that it's not a great, like that doesn't make sense. But there seems to be some disconnect with the folks actually running things. And I'm not sure, is there a
Yeah.
benefit they have to it? I mean, obviously there's some people, but I feel like people who are not actively benefited still end up participating in the
Yeah.
perpetuation of it. So I don't know if you could speak to any of that in a way that feels comfortable. That's a big one. So
Oh, yeah. No, I mean,
like, no.
but I think what you're highlighting is like lived experiences. And so as human beings, we understand what we've experienced. And a lot of times we don't understand what someone else has experienced, right? That starts to change. I mean, you see this with men that want to be better allies because they have daughters or their sister or mother, someone important woman in life shares their story. And they're like, whoa, didn't know. Now I
Mhm.
know and I can do better. Across races, though, there's a big disconnect. So we still live in a very segregated society in most parts of the world. Of course, that's very nuanced. But here in the States, 75% of white people don't even have a friend of color. So if you
Mhm.
don't have somebody you can talk to candidly about these experiences or see the world from their perspective, then it's going to create these kind of separations between us. And so when you have talking about corporate, most senior leadership teams, most CEOs, overwhelmingly white men. Most of them are able-bodied, straight, cisgender, all the things that were overrepresented with that demographic at a very, very high rate. I mean, north of 80 to 90%. So when you have folks leading organizations that don't reflect the broader population and can't, just by way of their own lived experiences, can't necessarily articulate, let alone know what to do about systemic issues that affect folks of color and folks with disabilities and women, then you've got this like friction. And
Mhm.
what a lot of corporate leaders are saying, like, oh, we care about diversity, like the statement, the donation, the one-time training. That's not what real commitment looks like. Like, real
Mhm.
commitment looks like we're in this for the long duration. We realize it's a consistent, intentional set of approaches that we need to have, just like we would with any other part of our organization if it was important. So that's the challenge, is getting people to care about this long term. At the same time, they may not, they may have just recently discovered that this is a problem.
Yes. Which, yes. um, one of my colleagues actually made a comment I'm going to share based on that. It says, I found that this from Mikey Famine. Thank you, Mikey. I found that most people are only one incident away from hating one race. Um,
Hmm.
in that, and I don't know if you have more clarifying things you want to share around that experience, Mikey. Um, but I was like, I could see, I could, having like a, because we globalize, right? Like have experience. I want to know that it was because of this. So then I
Hmm.
could shift that. Um,
Our brains, like, it's just how our brains work with categories and stereotypes, largely play off categorization that our brain naturally really likes. It's helpful in a lot of situations. It's really unhelpful with diversity because our brain, yeah, we record a negative experience we have with, say, it's a person of color, or say it's a white person for a person of color, whatever it is, somebody different from you. We put that experience in a bucket in our brain, and our brain starts to make associations of who I can trust, who I can't trust, who I need to steer clear of based on negative or positive experiences. Also, the challenge that Mikey points out is our brains are much more likely to remember negative experiences than positive ones. Again, for our
mhm.
survival, like that was dangerous. Don't be near that person again. But what's
Yeah.
not fair about that is if we behave consistently with that, then now we're operating under a stereotype, and we're applying the experiences we've had with one person to all people. And that's obviously problematic, because just because you had a negative experience with a woman doesn't mean every experience with a woman is going to be dangerous.
Mhm.
And we saw this with, like, Me
Right.
Too. The Me Too movement, right? We saw that backlash of like, man, I can't even be alone with a woman. It's like, okay, well,
Right.
that's interesting that that's a choice for you, but also that fear that it can create when we have that isolated experience. So just, I think just making sure you remind yourself, that was one experience. That is not,
Mhm.
and reflect on the negative experiences you've had, because you might be harboring some old fear too that you just might need to
Mhm.
unpack.
Right. Well, and the other thing is, when I very first started this journey myself, I had that idealistic, sort of like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to be inclusive. and, and at some point, it's like, oh, that's not how it works. Cool. It's
I
just
know. I
we get
wish
a
there was
little
just like
bit
an
further up the
inclusion
mountain.
switch. Like, all right, we're all on. We're ready. We're done.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
and
not that
that
easy.
no, one of the things that recently came out as a distinction that I found to be incredibly helpful was that the depersonalization, in terms of saying, like we were talking about with Me Too, it's not men that are a problem, it's patriarchy. And men are harmed by it and benefited by it in different ways than women, right? And then there's this gentleman, Chet Sisk, who he was on a show, he talking about feminine principled leadership and like sort of weird tension between male and female perspectives and men and women. And he said, like, here's the deal, we need both. Like, there's no
Hmm.
scenario in which somehow like it's all so we need to, like, the zero sum game way that we talk about it is not helpful, because actually we need everybody. Like, this isn't,
Right.
we're all in it together. We may not, like, we're all in the same storm even if we're not in the same boat, and we've like got, we can make it easier or harder, we can help each other out, but either way we're all doing this, right? And I thought that was what you were saying, like that the Me Too movement did kind of focus a little bit more on men, But if I step back and I say, all right, like it's patriarchy that's the problem. And there are plenty of women who participate in furthering patriarchy, sadly. And so recognizing, that distinction, I think was really helpful for me in terms of like redirecting conversations that maybe get a little bit too in the weeds. Cause it's like, I'm not saying anything about you. I'm not saying you're a bad person. Like, I can't do that. I made so many mistakes in my life. Like, I cringe at some of the things I said out loud to another human being. I'm like, whoa.
Right. We
And,
all make
you know,
mistakes.
but I lived in a world where I got to be corrected and change my behavior, and it worked out. Like, it was and I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's still, I don't know if I was in the same position today that how it would go. Cause I do think we're in a different landscape, and I think there's some benefits and some challenges to that. And my jury's out on the, net results. What do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think it's easier for people or harder? Like in terms of if someone runs into a recognition, like you said, they discover the problem. Do you
Yeah.
think there's more possibility for them to like learn, grow, change, or are there more barriers, or what's your take on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's again, when we have insulated communities. So, like, what we know that happened with COVID is our networks got a lot smaller and a lot more consistent. And a lot of times when we do that, that's code for people like us. So we're very much wired as human beings for affinity bias, meaning we like people like us. And so when our networks kind of shrank with the pandemic, a lot of us are listening more to people in our own echo chamber, people like us, people that are different from us, whether that's politically, religious. I mean, there's no shortage of issues in this news cycle nowadays. But thinking about what if we could meet in the middle? One of the pieces of feedback I get so often, I mean, just last week, I had a client share from a presentation. Like, it really felt like for people like me, this felt like not enough, right? Like, I've been living this experience forever. Like, really, now you're telling me to be patient. You're telling me to engage allies. I get that. That's be frustrating. I find it frustrating. And then you have a camp that's like, this was too much. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't like the fact that she used the word privilege. I didn't like that she threw all these new terms at me that I'd never heard of. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, I feel uncomfortable. So my choice is to. Now, what's interesting about that is I kind of read through the lines there that uh, the feedback was from a lot of their senior leaders, white
Hmm.
men. And so when you have this juxtaposition of people in leadership not seeing it's an issue or feeling like it's too much too quick, then you have folks in the front lines or just folks, I wish more broadly represented, that are saying, this isn't enough. I don't know how we meet in the middle. And I think what you talked about with like patriarchy, same goes for white supremacy, same goes for like ableist culture, like, homophobic, types of problems. Like, when we have this camp of like, you're bad, you're good, and there's no room
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
between. But acknowledge we're all living in a society that has had these problems historically, and we're getting better at some of them, but it's the system that we're participating in. It doesn't mean you did something to create the system, but at the end of the day, if you benefit from the system, like I benefit from a lot of systems as a white person, right? I don't benefit as much from a gender perspective, not always, sometimes. But all that to say, it's not good or bad. It's not right or
Mm-hmm.
wrong. It's just this is the way it is. And we're operating within these systems. So, what are you going to do to make sure the systems are inclusive for all? Because they most certainly are not working for everyone. And to some degree, things have gotten a lot worse in the last few years with the socioeconomic divide, with racial representation. Like, I think people think like summer of 2020, like what we marched, we protest, like the representation, the socioeconomic variables, like there's a lot of things, indicators that it's getting worse, in fact, at the time when some people want to be complacent or think it's too much change.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that I do feel like we're in a time and honestly, part of what prompted this podcast for me is that we are in a time of change, which has a lot of chaos to it. And it also, to me, means there's some opportunity, but we have to seize that opportunity. We have to, like, those of us who are doing this work that aren't, maybe in the dominant culture, what do you call it, chamber of dissemination, need to find ways to lift one another up, because there are folks that are really committed to creating better and doing good work. And at the same time, there's this overarching message of despair, and it's real. Like, it's not to Pollyanna my way out and say, oh, everything's fine. There's definitely stuff, but I'm more interested in working on solutions and ways to, like, connect people to stuff that's happening that can help them be more involved in this situation where we can do stuff that works for everybody. And
Mhm.
something you said earlier that I also really appreciate. One of the things I love about the podcasting community and the access is that there are so many podcasts out there from perspectives of people that are different from the dominant stories, and also just myself. Like, I never knew anything about barbershop culture in Black communities, and there's like 4 podcasts that are basically Black men talking about things they would talk in a barbershop. And so I listened to those. I'm like, wow, this is like a whole new world. And it's not intrusive. Like, I'm not asking some random person at work or my friend to, like, these are people who are putting their information out there and having these very frank, open conversations. And it's like, oh, wow, I get to learn about this cultural experience that was completely out of my realm, without feeling like I'm awkwardly stepping into somebody's space, right? Because and it's been really neat for me to just, like, get that. And I think that, once again, like you were saying, like, maybe folks don't have a friend, but there are so many different places where people are sharing their lived experience and their perspectives that you can tap into and get some sense of what that world is, without it being mediated by a commenter or a screenplay or something like that.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think something else that can be problematic sometimes, despite our willingness, our great intention to learn about the lived experiences of others, is we put the full burden of others educating us, right? And
Mhm.
so for allyship to work, to be there for somebody that's different from you, by nature, you don't understand what it's like to be them, right? So there's a disconnect. Now, one choice is to sit down with them and be like, "Tell me everything that's happened to you." Like, you
Mhm.
know, and there's a time and a place for that. If you have a place of trust with somebody, an existing strong relationship, then that's fair. Now, oftentimes it's like, "Oh, this happened. Like, is this something that happens to all of you people?" There's a judgment implied there. Like, I've heard just so many things like that just don't like, you're like, "Oh, you better not to say anything to say what you just said." But to your point, there's wonderful resources out there. So you don't even if you're like a lot of white folks, for example, that don't have any friends of color, or men that feel uncomfortable around women, whatever it is, like, you don't know what you don't know. That's okay. You will make mistakes. That is okay. Own them, get better, and do some education. Listen to the stories. I love the barber, yeah, the Black culture, pieces of Black culture that just are very unique. I mean, it's really fun to learn about other cultures, and while that's not, a monolithic experience, not all Black people have that experience, but it's fun to kinda tune into a podcast where you can just kinda eavesdrop on an existing conversation without putting, again, that burden on people to educate you about something that you can do your own research, you can do your own studying of this, and then maybe better showing up in the conversation saying, "Oh my gosh, I listened to this podcast. I thought it was so fascinating how I learned this," right? Then that's a
Mhm.
springboard to a trusting conversation that's gonna accelerate trust versus coming in with like, "Educate me on everything. Tell me what to do. Oh my gosh, I'm appalled. Like, I'm gonna make this about me and save the day." Like, no one wants
Mhm.
that. People
No.
want people to listen, and to better understand and to come into the conversation with something interesting to say that's relevant and important. It shows you did some work on your own.
Right. Like, and that's that you're willing to put in some effort. Like, I shouldn't, if I'm supporting you in an inclusion process or whatever that is, I shouldn't be doing more work than you are. Like, that's the step one, right? I do want to put this up real quick. If you want to know, and maybe you could talk a little bit about allies or coaches. There's the next pivot point, which is the company that Julie
Mhm.
founded. And then there's this program that she specifically thought would be a good fit for folks that listen to this podcast, allies or coaches. So can you talk a little bit about what that program is? I loved reading about it, but I don't want to steal your words.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so when we talk about allies, just to kind of level set there, yeah, it's people that want to be supportive of folks that are different from them. And it's not a self-proclamation. It's not again, rescue cape save the day situation. It's in the eye of the beholder, and it's the people doing the work day in and day out. And again, I think the I saw the question in chat by Mikey, like the hardest part I think is knowing what to do sometimes. Like it just I mean, honestly, that's probably the number one question I get from everyday folks. Like, what am I supposed to do? This isn't okay with me, or I want to be better, or the world to be better for my kids, whatever it is. They'll share that with me. And it's like, what do I do? I read the book, I listened
Hmm.
to the podcast, I did all the things I was supposed to do. And now I'm like out of ideas or just not sure what to do. And I think that journey looks very different based on your lived experiences, based on your skill set, based on your passion area. So, thinking about allies as coaches, one of the things we talk about in our speaking engagements is thinking about allyship as like an umbrella. And so if you imagine an umbrella with different spokes coming out, being a coach to someone that's different than you is certainly a way to show up as an ally. And coaching, when we talk about coaching, it doesn't mean giving the answers. It doesn't mean some like rah motivational speech like a sports coach. It's like really listening to somebody, asking them questions, and promoting what I call self discovery. It's really not about advice giving like a lot of kind of the myths around coaching that exist. But there's also other roles like mentoring. There's roles if you think about being a challenger. I mean, that's not as intuitive, but challenging people. We know that women and people of color just don't get as much challenging feedback or constructive feedback to get better. And that's part of personal growth and career development and getting stretch assignments. So being a challenger is important. Being an advocate is probably the one that people take most often is that's a way to advocate, amplify the voices of people different from you. Make sure when something happens that doesn't feel good, make sure that it's addressed, whether it's in the moment or a follow-up conversation. But there's an umbrella set of terms where you can choose how you want to show up based on your skill set, based on your position in the organization, based on the amount of positional authority or influence that you have. The last one's sponsorship, and this is one that's woefully underutilized. And a lot of times because we sponsor people like us. And so when we have folks in organizations that are in a position to sponsor somebody, they're in a position of power, they're influential, or have really strong relationships, a lot of times that's overrepresented in more of the white male representation. And so what tends to happen is we tend to sponsor and advocate, mentor for people like us. So it kind of perpetuates this systemic problem because we insulate our networks with people like us. So one of the most tangible things I could offer is diversify who you spend time with. Really think intentionally about who am I mentoring? Who's mentoring me? 12 years in corporate,
Hmm.
all my mentors are white women. Like, shame on me. That's a chance to get better. And it's something I'm actively working on now. But who are your sponsors? Who could be your sponsors? How could you have a meaningful conversation with somebody about how they could be more helpful in your career? Or even more importantly, how could you reach out to somebody that's different from you that you could be supportive in their career and just say, hey, I noticed you're leading this project, or I noticed in this meeting you said this. I'd love to just get to know you more. Like, would it be okay to have coffee or a virtual, chat? You don't have to be creepy or weird about it. You don't have to be like, I want to be your mentor. I'm going to be, like that's probably not going to feel right. I've had people do that to me and it's like, okay, great. Like, there's something wrong with me. But, the good intentions, again, sometimes the impact's just not quite there. So make sure you're thinking intentionally about it. Think about those different roles and think about how you can diversify the folks you spend time with in those roles.
And do you have a program around that? Or like people could kind of like come and study, or how does that, or
Oh
is
yeah.
it more?
Yeah, the program's titled Lead Like an Ally. So it's the book I wrote, gosh, right at the heels of the pandemic. I will never forget April of 2020 at book launch and all this book tour.
Wow.
No, not so much.
Not so
It was
much.
fine. It all worked out, but it was a sad few months. But I wrote the book with really the idea of like how corporate America could facilitate inclusive experiences through a fable. So it's a woman going through kind of her journey and people read the book and they're like, oh my gosh, like, did you like follow me through corporate? Like, this is exactly what happened to me. And it was all sorts of people of color, women, we really try to keep it intersectional, even though, my lived experience is of a white woman. And so anyway, from that, a lot of conversations happen, especially in the corporate environment, as you can imagine, summer of 2020, and just tumultuous, just so much change coming at us and continues to, that leaders were saying, yeah, I want to know how to be an ally. So we actually have a self-paced program based on the book that goes through kind of 10 attributes of allyship. It helps you unpack with assessments and tools and resources and self-reflection activities. So that's something we're really proud of, and a resource that I think, people can answer. It helps you answer a lot of the questions we're talking about today. Like, one
Mhm.
of the biggest things, ahas, I've had in my own podcast and interviewing guests is we always talk about their story at the beginning. Everyone has a diversity story. Like, what ignited you into this, made you want to come into this world? And, everyone shares their vantage point and they're coming at it from such a different place. But that passion, that gets ignited from your own, like, oh, this didn't feel right to me, or this happened to me. And then
Mhm.
it can be fleeting to figure out how to like carry forward that momentum. And so it's really a set of intentional, consistent acts over time. But people don't need to read all the books I have on my bookshelves and listen to all the podcasts I've listened to, like the 10,000 hour rule. I think Malcolm Gladwell had that, right? Like, I just don't think it should have to be that complicated for everyday allies. Like, it should be easier to know how to show up in this conversation and to have hard conversations that are productive, that get change, and change, the cultures and worlds around us. I think we can all lead from where we're at. And yeah, that's the Lead Like an Ally program is the one we're excited about nowadays.
That sounds great, and I popped the link up, and I'll also make sure it's in the show notes, and, for our listeners, it's nextpivotpoint.com, and I'll let the rest of it you can probably navigate the nav bar. So where do you go for inspiration? Like, this could be exhausting, challenging experience. So when you're having a day or a month or in April 2020, what
Or
do you
a
do to get
year.
yourself or a year? Yeah, like what do you do? Or
Yeah.
what do you encourage people to do? However you
It's
want to
hard. I
show
mean,
it
I
to
think
us.
just acknowledging self-care, burnout's a big issue. And it's a big issue with everybody right now. But we know women and people of color experience burnout at a much higher rate than the majority group does. And that's just, you're not reflected, you're, having more marginalized experience. There's a lot of reasons why that happens in nearly all contexts that data bears out. So for me, knowing burnout is high. This work is requires a lot of compassion, and you get compassion fatigue. It's really finding ways to fill up my bucket so that I can continue to be here. Because if I don't take care of my health, and if I don't take care of
Mhm.
like the things that I'm passionate about, if I don't feed my soul, there were just some things that I was doing that really unhealthy behaviors early on in my business. Like, you just go down these, rabbit holes. Right, I would get hooked on these documentaries about racial heavy issues, and, he was like my
Mhm.
5-year-old at times like, Mom, are you watching another documentary about Black people?" Like, yeah." And, she's like, basically
Mhm.
like, "You're crying again. Like, what are you doing?" And so I just realized, I was like, "Okay." And this is my privilege in being able to monitor and my exposure to these heavy issues is, maybe a documentary or two a month is good. Maybe a heavy book or two a month is good to sprinkle in with a positive, inspirational one. Like, maybe these
Mhm.
podcasts I'm listening to don't always have to be depressing. So anyway, just understanding burnout is high in this work, whether you do it for a living or do it, as a personal passion, but also acknowledging you've got to balance out the activities that give you energy. You have to find a way to build those into your day. And for me, it's just a short walk. I like to take a
Mhm.
relaxing bath a couple times a week. Getting time out of the house once a week with my partner. Like, there's just things like that that I've tried to like systematize into my life
Mhm.
to remind myself to have fun, to chill out. And if you don't build it as a practice, we can easily get, down the rabbit hole or in our email boxes, social media. Yeah. It can be unhealthy sometimes.
Well, yeah, when I was doing a lot of the LGBTQ activism, I would just, because people are passionate and they care, right? I'm like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. I was a runner at the time. And it's like, you got to pace yourself because you cannot run 26 miles the way you would run, a 3K or 5K. You've got to like split that out a little bit. And it's just, if you want to get to the end of the race, you have to give yourself the resources to get there. And that's part of the problem. Like you said, like if you have the privilege of financial benefit or gender benefit or racial benefit, then you have the ability maybe to regulate that in a way that somebody else doesn't. They're just always running a marathon at sprint levels. And that's what we're trying to fix. Like we don't want that to be how they have to go. But
you get exhausted. Yeah. You get burnout.
Exactly. And Mikey said this, I thought it was a comment on what you said before, but like he said, the not taking over is big for him, that he finds allies around him, gets so excited and try to lead instead of support. And it's cool, right? Like, yay, you're here. I love it. And try to help.
Yeah, because we take over. I had a male, a well-intentioned, I hope, male ally a few months ago share that story with me. He's like, I went to this allyship training. It was a series we'd helped an organization with, and he was attending. Really great intentions after the conversations, like, all right, I'm going to just hit the streets and talk to women about these issues. And so he shows up at like a corporate lunch table of women and is like, hey, I'm here to be an ally for you. I'm in this ally program. And they're like, no thanks, And I think about him a lot. It's like, he didn't have to say it that way. Like, how did you think? Like, how would you react to that? But the way you frame it is so important. Of like, hey, I just watched this, or I just learned of this. I'm in this program. I would be so curious if you'd be willing to share your insights or your experiences with me. Totally different conversation versus here I am. Let me save the day. Let me make it about me. So, and I think when people get uncomfortable, they take over and talk too much too. So it's usually a sign of discomfort of like, I think a lot of white people get, we were taught culturally not to talk about racism or to be colorblind. I know for me, I'd unpack that false narrative and unlearn that and relearn it. And so early on, I would, probably talk too much, probably make it about race too much. And so you just had to learn through the discomfort and kind of, relearning and replacing those old mantras with new ones, that you'll get better at it, right? You'll get more comfortable, although it's always going to be a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the whole growth is always there. If you're going to grow in any way in life, there's always going to be some discomfort. And in interpersonal stuff is really interesting because I think most of us have this instinct of, oh, I should be good at this. I should know how to parent or communicate with my partner or talk about different topics like sexism or racism. And the reality is that like most of us don't have those skills. Like we have to learn them. And there's no shame in that. But there is sometimes that feeling of, why don't I know this? Like it feels like at this point. So what is your best advice that either you received or you were talking to someone and you heard it come out of your mouth and you're like, wow, that was a good one, or both?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, probably the biggest lessons from kind of all the books on I mean, now there's a ton of books on allyship. There wasn't when I first started writing about it, so I'm super thankful there's a slowly building bookshelf full of these books. But the aha that I've had has just been, do it afraid. Like, seriously, like this is something that's not going to feel, like you said, fully comfortable. If you were doing it right, people came to me like, I am doing the ABC, then I would be really worried that they weren't, because you're doing it. You shouldn't have to talk about doing it. I mean, it's one thing to pat yourself on the back and, acknowledge wins, that's for sure. But it's more about acknowledging what I don't know, right? Fears I have that maybe I've acknowledged or not acknowledged. Why is this showing up for me? What could I be doing to be a better ally? And those are, questions that I wrestle with and keep me up at night is how do we make people stay interested in this work when it's not always, in your news feed? And people get complacent and we go back to kind of the status quo and why do we need to change? And if we could just acknowledge that it is a problem and we could all be better when we support the problem, and that requires us to do things differently for difference.
Mhm.
So you got to shift a little bit. And I'm not asking anybody to move across the country or start a new organization or even not everybody wants to shout from the rooftops on social media or at protests. Like there's not one way to show up in this. It's really a choose your own adventure approach. And so letting people co-create, type of allyship experiences they want to have, I think is really important at a time sometimes when we can be polarizing, you're good, you're bad, like we talked about. There's so much in between. There's so many people that are just stuck in the middle and don't know what to do.
Yeah. No, I think the despair part is real in that the folks will see it. It's an Al Gore quote from his Inconvenient Truth that it stuck with me, which was like, so many people jump from denial to despair. It's like, no, 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 it's not a problem. Too. I can never fix it. It's like, yeah, no, you can't. It's cool. You're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Just do a little. If everybody
Climate
does a
change,
little.
racism, like it's like these are heavy things, right? Like they're not going to get
Mhm.
solved for overnight. Yeah.
And so if everybody just does a little, eventually, but you're like, as you say, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we also have to note those distinctions between what's us that I can do and what's systemic. Like
Mhm.
I drive a car. I'm part of the problem. I also don't have a lot of choices. Like and that's true for a lot of us. Like and that like taking that away and saying, all right, this isn't a bad good thing. Like you said, it's just simply a fact, until the system gets a little bit more shifted, we're all part of the problem, no matter how hard we try.
Yeah,
And
and that
so,
doesn't make me a
and
bad person either. The
mm-mm,
system was here before I was born. But
yeah,
what am I doing to shift those systems, right? Could I
right.
walk or ride my bike once a day instead or once a week instead of drive or whatever it is, those little
Mhm.
subtle shifts if they would add up cumulatively to so much positive change.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the hope that I like to look for that to remind, like you said, we're negatively biased. And so really looking to say, all right, here's some ways that we can do things. Show up in your community, be there, disrupt things when you can. And then what's the best way for people to get involved with what you're doing? Like if they're a company
Yeah.
or just a random human.
Yeah, we work with individuals. Like I said, the Lead Like an Ally self-paced online programs available on our website for purchase and has lots of activities and helps you kind of go through your ally plan. That's for individuals. And then we do a ton of work in corporate. So if you're thinking about, DEI strategy, getting the pulse of where people are at with their lived experience in the workplace with like listening sessions and assessments. We do a ton of training too on allyship and how to be more inclusive as a leader and just like you said,
Mhm.
an everyday human. So that's all on nextpivotpoint.com. And if you're interested and just want a slow trickle of ideas in your newsfeed, I'm on LinkedIn and I post every day. So just look for me there. You can follow me, Julie Kratz, Kratz. And I post daily new information about this topic.
It's really great. I mean, for a one person perspective right here. Like I said at the beginning, I'll post your LinkedIn here too, so folks have it. But it's really been super helpful to me, honestly, because there's always those bite-sized moments or those little things. It's like, oh, and just a reminder too, because I think that's especially honestly working from home and as a solopreneur, you feel real isolated. And something like that comes across my feed, and I'm like, I am not alone. There
We're
like
not, we're not.
there's lots of folks doing what they can. It's a little bit uplifting to have that, have my my little group of folks that Blue Unicorn's another one. I just love Madison Butler. She's so
Oh,
amazing.
she is a hoot. Oh my gosh, I love she
Great.
really pushes like she's pushing really great content and she is doing it without fear. I just love how bold she is.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's so inspiring, and I love what you're up to. I'm so excited to have had you on here, and for it. Let me say, anything else that you want to leave? Any final words with people or anything like
Just do
that?
something. Do something. Start with one thing.
Yeah.
Do not underestimate the power of your voice in this world, and lean in. Do it afraid, and I'd love to stay in touch, listeners, as well.
Thanks, and thank you, Mikey, for your questions, and we appreciate you being here. It's always fun to have some folks around. This will be up on Apple Podcasts fairly soon, depending on how busy Monday is. And I'll see you guys all in a week, actually. Monday, August 29th. Dennis and Jesse Peckett are talking about the company they founded as a married couple to increase intimacy in their lives, which I think is going to be interesting. And then I won't be doing any shows in September because I'm going to attend Amsterdam Climate Week. It's very exciting.
Awesome.
So I will be offline for a little bit, which is a brand new experience. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And I will see you all next Monday. And thank you so much, Julie. I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having
Bye.
me. Bye.